So I think we should start by saying, well, thanks for coming. I think it's going to be a very small, intimate conversation, which will be nice, I think. So I think maybe I just want to say that when we start this conversation, that to remember Prashani Naidu, who's our director and friend and colleague who passed away at the end of last year. And the first time we did did a lunch break in this format in Johannesburg was very much with Prashani. It was a conversation within SWOP that with Prashani, and we actually, in that case, we as SWOP cooked for everyone and had a discussion at the Stevenson Gallery. And so Prashani is both very missed here, but I think was also present with us here. So, but I think we kind of wanted to do this conversation in a way that could speak across our different work and how it intersects. And I think in particular, Niren released a book at the end of last year, Writing Around the Wicket, that has an essay on Salem that comes from work that Niren and I were doing together in Salem that started in 2018 or 2019. When did we get down to Salem?
I think it was
2018.
Yeah, 2018.
Yeah. So the project started a little bit before that, but early 2018 we got down to Salem where we met Mrs. Madinda, who is one of the farmers on the restituted land. And her family has been caretakers of one of the farms in Salem. And we were thinking a lot around, it's very relaxed, we don't have to worry. And we've been thinking about questions of restitution. So at the time, I think when we got down to Salem, the case had been through the Constitutional Court. And there was a judgment that basically the land that was being claimed was a commonage, and the land was then divided the land among the landowners and the community, and the Salem community that had made the claim. And I think it raised a lot of issues around the way that we think about land and we think about restitution and the limits of how restitution is conceived of in South Africa. And I think the way that land is really reduced to just a commodity. And when dispossession happened, so much more was dispossessed, so much more was taken than just land. So much was entangled with that land that was taken and is not being returned. And I think some of those are the questions we're asking. And Dineo Skosana, who's here as well, is also released a book at the beginning of this year, No Last Place to Rest, which looks at dispossession post-94, particularly in mining and affected communities, but particularly looking at grave relocations. And we've all been, Niren, myself, and Dineo recently in Lepalale, and we're looking at how many former labor tenants have been denied access to their ancestral graves. And I think one of the things that was interesting was the kind of resonances with what also happened in Salem. So I think the way I wanted to start the conversation is to open up to Mrs. Madinda to speak a little bit about her father's experience, because when the judgment was made to share the land in Salem, the Cameron who wrote the judgment said that the two churches in the cricket field that was proof that was owned by the white farmers, and that was excluded from the land that was shared. But the land where the community was living when they were dispossessed, the land where the ancestral graves from that community are, was not excluded from the land. That was not automatically given to the community, and that has not been restituted. And I think that Ms. Madinda's father tried to go visit his parents' graves, to visit his ancestral graves, and has not been able to go onto that farm. Her family still can't have access to those graves. So I think speaking to to those specific experiences is one way to open up this question of what is not being restituted, what is not being considered when we think about restitution. How is our understanding of dispossession and restitution being narrowed through the legislation that doesn't account for everything that was taken? And so it doesn't account for the actual history that's happened in these spaces. So, Ms. Medina, if you're happy to start with the experiences, and I think your father's experiences of trying to visit those graves, I think, were very important.
Thank you, Simon. My name is Lungu. I was born in Salem in 1956. But in 1970, my father was chased away to go to find a place. But we just went to Paddy. And by the time he got there, the owner of the farm just gave him just a bag of meals. My father was also born there. His forefathers born there. All the graves were there. When we come back, fortunately, kwabakho le nto yokuba kuthiwe masibuyele emhlabeni. Sawube sibuyela ke emhlabeni. Our father ke caretaker, one of the farmers. Kwindawo besihlala kuyo, asibuyelanga kuyo exactly ifama le. Umlungu lo wale fama akafunanga into yokuba sibuyele kuyo, akafunanga kunikezela ngefama inikezela futhi.
Okay. We didn't go right back to where the land that was previously dispossessed was. The white farmer did not want to allow them to move back onto that land.
Endaphe ethenga ifama ibingeyo yakhe. Ezi fama zinamanzi. Amangcwaba asekhaya angaphaya. Then now benze idam elikhulu. Akuyeki ngaphaya kulaa ndawo inamangcwaba inala ndawo sasihlala kuyo.
The farmer bought that land, built a dam that also sort of obstructed the previous owners, people who lived there, their ability to access their ancestral graves on the other side.
Satraya into yokuba siye umzukulwana wakhe ke lomkhoyo akavuma into yokuba siye phaa emangcwabeni. Ngoba xa ufuna ukuya phayana kulaa ndawo kufuneka ngoku uyazi uba ukhwela kwezaa bhowuthi zakho. Kuneebhowuthi ngoku azenzeleyo for abantu abasuka kwiindawo ngeendawo.
The grandchild of the farmer, even though they tried to access the ancestral graves, denied them access. For them to access those graves, they'd have to use the boats that the farm has for sort of water activities related to tourism.
We as abantu abamnyama, as black people, we believe on the land emhlabeni. Ngoba uba ngabana unengxaki ufuneka ubheke emangcwabeni uyothetha khona kunye nezinyanya zakho. Ngoku izinyanya zingaphi asikwazi uthini ukuya kuzo.
Yeah, this has created a problem that can even be understood in sort of spiritual terms because of the connection between land, graves, and the living people who, whenever they'd have challenges and problems in their lives, They want to reconnect with their ancestors. Normally they go to the graves to speak with their ancestors for assistance, clarity, guidance, etc. But now there's that disconnect.
Even if uyagula kubakho into ethi hamba pothetha nezinyanya zakho ubheke emangcwabeni uyothetha nezinyanya zakho. Ngoku siya njani ke ngoku thina phaa kulaa mangcwaba? Sifuna indlela yokuya phaa kulaa mangcwaba. And laa mhlaba sizalelwe kuwo, ootata bethu bazalelwe phayana, nootata babo nootatomkhulu babo bazalelwe phaa. And sithe sabe siwufumene umhlaba, andazi noba mhlawumbi urhulumente ucinga njani na. Laa mlungu uyedwa, umhlaba mkhulu, thina sibanintsi, sifuneka siowune ke ngoku lo mhlaba. Le mbijana basinike yona, and imbijana basinike yona ayinamanzi. Banqamle imilambo le, benza la madama ne, ukwenzela uba amanzi angezi kweli cala lethu, sikwazi uprodyusa. Awukwazi usebenza umhlaba amanzi engekho. Ifama ngamanzi, ngoba funeka izilwanyana zifumene amanzi, abantu funeka befumene amanzi. Ngoku siphila ngamanzi e-borehole, and then ke ngoku ziyonakala ezaa zinto konakale, and loo manzi alo borehole ayawunakalisa umhlaba ngokwezatyiwa zawo. Uthi uplanta njena into ibe ijike ikhala, mhlawumbi ibe yelo, ungakwazi ke ngoku ukuthi ungayithengisa okanye ungayitya, ngoba kaloku yonakele. Iinkomo ziyafa ngenxeni yamanzi. Kusandukufa iinkomo ngoku ezininzi, mane kusifa iinkomo. Bakufumanisa into yokuba ngaphakathi isiswili lomile, alinamanzi. Zisela amanzi asedatyeni amancinci, ne, ale ntshizana bikhe yakho. Sele loo manzi, then ke ngoku kubekho ke ngoku eza worms zirawundi, kuthiwa zenza ngamanzi angahambiyo. Uyabona? Bona baneenkomo ezininzi, baneentoni, banomhlaba omkhulu. Then babone into yokuba ngoku ingathi thina abantu bamnyama asikwazi ukuwusebenzisa umhlaba.
Okay. So there's a feeling of sort of continued injustice, even with the restitution process, where the community is feeling like the decision around restitution benefited the farmer more than it benefited the community, because the community now has to be working smaller, piece of land. Land is downstream of water sources. The river that the community would have depended on that land has sort of been dammed up by the farmer, meaning that the community now has to depend on borehole water, which is not of good quality. They're dealing with loss of cows because of that water, planting vegetables with that water. The vegetables don't grow all that well, so it's so there's a feeling of the restituted land has come with more problems, rather than it opening up opportunities for people and bettering their lives.
And urhulumente ke ngoku akangeni asincedise. Into esiyinidayo luncedo. Siyafuna usebenza umhlaba, ngoku siyintlekisa kubantu abamhlophe. Basihleka bathi asikwazi usebenza umhlaba. Silima late, kuyalinywa izinto ziphume zingakwazi ukuba right, ngenxa yento yokuba kaloku asinazo izinto zokwenza zosebenza. Itrekta ingakhona, asinayo idizili yokufaka etrekteni. And sinida uqeqesho, abantu baqeqeshwe bawazi umsebenzi wabo, ngoba kaloku bebesebenza umhlaba bengayazi into yobana nale mveliso lo mlungu isaphi. Uyaqonda? Although ebehlala kule fama, umfama lo yena uzawuthi enza le nto nale nto nale nto, ne, but apho kufuneka usekhona imarket yaziwa nguye uba imarket uyenza njani and ke soza kuxelela ukuthi imarket uyifumana phi. And ke ngoku ke bona bebencediswa ngulaa rhulumente. Ngoku umuntu emsisiqwesini uyancediswa sengurhulumente.
So there's a challenge even in terms of agricultural extension services, training around even the business of farming, because even if you manage to get over the sort of initial challenges and you can plant and and so on, but the problem that you're going to have is how do you get your goods to market? Where is the market? That side of the business. So there's a sense that government has been failing in that regard in terms of providing that support, and there's a feeling that the white commercial farmers previously benefited from such close relationships with the pre-94 government. You know, the support that was there for them in terms of building their agricultural businesses. Yet there isn't something similar for the community right now, and it ends up sort of in a self-fulfilling prophecy of, you know, black community members can't work the land, yet these in effect they're feeling very hamstrung.
Uyabona ke ngoku kubakho le ngxaki yento yokuba nithi nifuna usebenza umhlaba, kubekho abantu abangafuni usebenza umhlaba. Ngoba kaloku ngexesha kunikezelwa umhlaba ebantwini, abantu mababuyele ebheke. Omnye umuntu uzange ahlabe phayana, yayifemeli yakhe yayihlaba. Umuntu ujonge into yokuba kuzawufumana imali. Then ke ngoku our fathers bona bebelwela umhlaba, bakhange bafune imali, bafune umhlaba, besithi umhlaba lilifa labantwana bethu.
So there are intra-community challenges as well, where some community members, you might find that they're sort of disconnected from the land, they've migrated to elsewhere, but historically had that connection with the land and had been dispossessed. But when the restitution opportunity came, they chose money instead of the restituted land, and so that causes sort of divisions in the community, even in terms of how to manage the land.
Sasiyi-trust, then ke ngoku sayi-CPA. Endinento i-trust mos yona the chairperson nguye osoloko ethatha i-decision engathathi ebantwini. I-CPA ke ngoku yona funeka ithathe i-decision apha ebantwini, ingazenzeli into. Ngoku kubakho ke ngoku lo yantlukwana yento yokuba lona ufuna uzenzela nje bengenile nje wasekomitini ekhokela i-trust inantsika i-CPA, ufuna ukwenza into ngokunokwakhe. But kuGoogle Nkwimpi, by the time engu-Minister we-Agriculture, uthi phaa kuthi eSalem akunakwenza nenye into abantu bengazi. Funeka abantu bazi kuqala into yokuba yintoni nabayifunayo. Whatever ubona into right, but iza ebantwini. Nokuba ubusowugqibile mhlawumbi yafutshanisa le nto, kodwa iza ebantwini. Ibe sisigqibo sabantu esithi sifuna le nto. Ngoku ngoku le ndaba yethu ye-farming imane idregeka ngenxa ke yaloo nto, yento yokuba kaloku ikomiti ekhoyo ayinayo laa mbono, ibe nalaa view yento yokuba sifuna ntoni, ifuna ukwenza into ngokunokwayo. Phayana indawo umlungu lona ukhona uMr Fike wayesenza ukutya kwenkomo kunomatshini. Instead yento yokokubana sithenge sithi sifuna aba matshini kurhulumente, sisike sathi laa mlungu makahambe kunye nezaa zinto wemka nezaa zinto zakhe, kanti laa ndawo ibiyindawo yokwenza ukutya. Umhlaba waseSalem umhle utyebile, ufuna just izandla zokusebenza, abantu abanombono wokwenza laa nto. basebenze umhlaba ukuze abantu baphile.
So there's a challenge with the communal property association. Challenges around lack of vision, lack of leadership, and also just people sort of truncating sort of processes and wanting to give themselves the authority to make decisions without engaging other association members, bringing them along, and making sure that whatever sort of decisions that are made are by and of the people. So instead, it seems there's a gulf between the leadership of the CPA, sort of like the chairperson, and the community members. And that obviously causes tension.
Njengoba urhulumente xa urhulumente ukhona, urhulumente akancedisi ukuba kubekho imvano, but usikaba ipart yeproblem urhulumente athathe icala ungayazi uba yengoku ngaba mhlawumbi intoni ayifumanayo yena apha kwaba bantu, ngoba ke abantu ba-end apha ngoku beqeshisa ngezinye zeefama kubantu abamhlophe. Yabona babuyisela umhlaba kubantu abamhlophe. Ewe imali iyafuneka, but kaloku kufuneka ibe sisigqibo sabantu, ingabi sisigqibo sabantu abathile.
So like for instance, decisions like renting out some of the land to white commercial farmers, which is in effect taking the community back in terms of what the community wants or wanted, was access to land so that they can work the land, live off the land, etc. But because of that lack of vision, lack of leadership, and also lack of engagement of the community, you find the leadership of the CPAs taking decisions that go against the spirit of what the community wants in terms of being able to work the land.
Even laa ndawo ke ngoku bendisithi ibiyilaa ndawo yokwenza ukutya, ibiyiholo yokwenza ukutya, then bayenze ke ngoku yayiholo yento yokokuba bayirenovatile. Kuthathwa laa mali kwarenovathwa kwenziwa iholo yento yokuba kungenwe imitheni khona. But ke ngoku ngexesha bekuxoxwa Constitutional Court, ke kuthiwe phayana xa belungu bengavumi nalaa ndawo yecricket nalaa holo, babesithi bona ilantuka yabo le ngathi yintoni na kuba kudala iye yabo, yaqonda uba kuba laa ndawo ujonga laa ndawo uba yilaa ndawo kanye linalaa cricket yilena kokuliwa kuyo.
Okay.
Abantu abamnyama besifa phaa.
Okay.
Abafuni ke ngoku ke nalaa ndawo. Abafuni ke ngoku neholo, bathi thina abantwana bethu ngamasela, abafuni abakwazi uba baye kulaa holo. I-CPA ke ngoku yona ngoba ke unobhala uyile phayana, sathi kunobhala sifuna aye phayana sikwazi ungena iintlanganiso zethu xa sinentlanganiso. Ubuya unobhala esithi kuthiwa thina abantwana bethu singamasela, ngamasela, baphelela kuloo nto. Isibeka phi ke ngoku ke thina singabantu ekubeni uba bekuthiwa makube luxolo, ekuxolo oluthi andaba luzaba luxolo olunjani, masihlalisane, bajike ngokubona babe nezinto abangazifuniyo bathina singene kuzo, sawuhlalisana njani. And basinike umhlaba omncinci, umhlaba owomileyo. Ndiyakhumbula kakuhle, ukhona umfo ekuthiwa ngumlungisi Rwandela. Umlungisi Rwandela was the party wayesebenzisana kunye bonke kunye nala maxhego for uba umhlaba mawuze. But uthe xa ecebisa yena wangathi ngokufuna uthatha indawo yekomiti, kanti ebecebisa into yokuba before nisayine khanize nale agreement ke siyibone uba ithini na, nize nayo kuthi ndiyayicela nindinike njeke ndiyifunde ndikwazi ukufundela abantu. Kaloku asifundanga sonke. Uyakwazi ukuthi ufundile kubekho izinto basifundela ntwinye sonke. Yena ufundele ubugqwetha, omnye ufundele ubutishara. Uyayibona laa nto? Nufundele ubutishara akayazi laa nto ifundelwe bubugqwetha. So kanti phayana kuneklo ekhoyo ethi uba nizithathile ezifama aniphindi nifumane umhlaba. Elo xesha ke asikagqibi ukukleyima. Kusekho ifama esingekazifumani ekufuneka sizifumene. Okay, ngithetha gqithi.
Okay, sorry. There's a part that I missed the first time. So Mao was saying that so with these challenges with the CPA, you find that government is not being impartial and actually is part of the problem in terms of choosing sides. And obviously that causes more tensions, lack of trust, etc., and suspicions around, what sort of side deals there might be between government officials and CPA leaders. And Ma also talked about the land that was not restituted back to them, the sort of 2 cricket fields, and there was a community hall there, was highly contested land historically, but the white commercial farmers argued unsuccessfully that was, I think what she was trying to say was sort of an important part of the heritage, and did not want it to be a part of the restituted land. But now the community has tried to use that hall. There's a hall there. Has tried to use that hall, and they haven't been given access to that hall. They've tried to have their community meetings there. And so she raises the question, so she says that the reply from the, I think,
I'm not bad.
From the secretary was that the commercial farmers said that the youth, community youth, are criminals. So I don't know if that's connected to breakings that had been happening or whatever, but that was part of the reason why that they said that there couldn't be access to that community hall. So that sort of created discomfort within the community in terms of, well, this restitution was supposed to be a process that, in terms of outcome, was supposed to come with, was supposed to resolve issues of land dispossession, find sort of like a lasting sort of a peace between the two elements of the local community. But clearly, if there's continuing sort of a closing off of land and resources in terms of like the community hall, that has them, asking questions about, what is the state of the relations between, the community on the one side and the white commercial farmers on the other. Last point, then she speaks to when the deal was struck on the land that was to be restituted. There's a fellow, Mlungisi Khwentela was someone who was working quite closely with them, helping them in that process, and he wanted to see the written agreement on what was to be restituted, but unfortunately, again, these issues of contestations over leadership, control of the process, etc. It seems he was sidelined. he didn't get to have access to the document, and so. But it turns out that the document was signed. Within the document was a clause that said, once you've agreed to this, there can no longer be other claims. And Ma says that that was a serious problem for them because there were other claims. And obviously for them, it would have been important for someone like Mlungisi Khwandela to have a look at that document because many of the community members are not educated. Some who might be educated are not educated as lawyers to be able to deal with such technical legal documents. So, yeah, that created more problems for the community.
Like the farmer ke ngoku thina sizalelwe kuyo ka Simon Gush yilindele le nithetha ngayo ifama. Ngelishwa ikweli cala lingaphumanga bekusuppose into yokuba ke ngoku kuyaphinda kuyakleyinywa for zona. Xa ke ngoku singayifumani uba yiyona fama inamanzi, yiyona fama ityebileyo. That means asube siphinde sifumane ke ngoku xa kunjalo. Ngoba kaloku ikomiti le yona ivele ayafuna kucetyiswa. Kanti ke kuthiwa funeka uthathe uye kubantu abafuna amava ebantwini, kubantu abebengaphambili. Wena ufikayo iya komnye umntu lo ebekunathi ke ebeyiphethe into. Uve ukwazi ufumana la mava uba le nto ihambe yamaphina. Ubrother wam omkhulu ibinguchairperson ngelo xesha we-land claim, uMthuthuzeni Madinda. Ibinguye ke ngoku ebenguchairperson. But bebesebenzisana kunye noRhwentela. uRhwentela eyipati yaloo nto. But now even ngexesha ke ngoku kuthathwa amagama, oRhwentela bebebekwe ngaphandle kodwa ngabona bantu bebekho kuqala. Oononzube bamagama abo iifemeli zabo zingekho kodwa bingabona bantu bebekhona. Aba bakhoyo ke ngoku ngabantwana abafikayo abangayazi ngoba le nto ibiqalele phi. Nathi ngoku siyoluphala siphethe lo mhlaba seseleni kodwa akukabikho nto. Amkile amaxhego amaninzi. Akusekho maxhego ngoku ekuzawumane uyobuza kuwo ukuba kwenzeka ntoni na. Sekusela abantwana abangaphantsi nalapha kum abangafuni ukumamela.
So, with that agreement, the signing of that agreement, sort of some of the most critical land, never mind just in terms of, I think, never mind in terms of restitution, but just in terms of access to water. So ecologically, the most critical land was not part of the restituted land, and was the land that was excluded in terms of future restitution, which then landed the community in this difficult position of having land that is in many ways, well, I won't say unusable, but difficult to use in terms of access to water. And so there was a sidelining of some of the critical people who were involved in the beginning, that as the process came to its end in terms of a decision on restitution. People like the gentleman I was referring to earlier were not part. The previous chairperson was not part neither. Ma's elder brother, some critical families that had been part of the process all along excluded. Now there is a challenge of sort of historical knowledge. The older people are passing on, have passed on. The people that are there are younger, without that historical knowledge. Those that the younger people that are there sort of Ma says that they're not advisable people. They don't quite listen to advice, and it's seemingly it's challenging working with them. And on top of that, they don't quite know the history. Connected to that history would obviously would be knowing, what land was part of the community, and where graves are, why that land is important, etc. And that sort of, I think, ties back to the point of people who were beneficiaries, but you might find they were actually outside of the community.
I- ingxaki yam okay
I don't want to interrupt you.
okay wenza nje ingxaki yam endicinga uba sinayo kukufuna uncediswa. Urhulumente angenelele asincedise sikwazi ukuhamba indlela enye, sikwazi usebenza ngoba siyafuna usebenza. Besisebenza phayana, as a result ifama endikuyo mna biyeyona fama iphuhlileyo apha ekusebenzeni. As a result urhulumente u-agriculture besithi xa efikelwa ngabaphetheyo yena kuqala apho bemsa khona bemsa eCastle Farm, ifama endihlala kuyo. Safumana ke besifumene even uqeqesho ke kurhulumente lokujonga umhlaba kwiinto ze-plants, alien plants, ukwenzela for amadlelo. Samenza uFarm Together uba singasebenza njani nathi sisonke, but abantu khange bafune usondela. Si-endaphe ngoku siba ngaba bantu bakulaa fama qha. Ngoku loo nto yenza ke ngoku ibe ngathi urhulumente ujonge icala eliyi-one, akalijonge elinye icala.
Yeah, again, the community, particularly the farm that they are on, they're very motivated with regards to working the land. Historically had a close relationship with the Department of Agriculture because of their level of productivity on the land, even with the challenges that Ma has talked about. So when the department would have higher ups coming around, that's the farm that they want to go to show off to their higher ups. But the challenge is that other community members have not wanted to participate, and that has sort of left sort of like a smaller core group working the farm, and in a way it can look like certain people are being favored, or that particular farm is being favored, but then it goes with their level of involvement and enthusiasm. So yeah.
No, I think it'd be. I wanted to sort of open it up to Dineo and Niren as well. I think it's really important to hear your experiences. And I think, but I was also sort of curious. I mean, Dineo, we went for the first time. Well, you went for the first time with us yesterday, and you can see. I mean, I think the way in which this judgment was conceived of, I think, is supposed to be this way of sharing the land, of bringing the community, in a sense, together on the land. There's still such strong divisions, but I'm also sort of just curious as to your experiences or your first impressions of Salem and what's happening in the space and how that might resonate with your work.
So, I mean, I had engaged with your work before, which I've always found quite interesting because it raises pertinent questions around the program of land reform in South Africa, but also problems relating to restitution. But I think now interacting with the space and also speaking to Umama, it started making me to really think about the process of restitution itself. How people were dispossessed and how we don't always sort of engage that history in detail in terms of how did the process work itself out. The idea is that when people were dispossessed and how the process of the system then is sort of thought about in the post-apartheid era is that people have to bring about evidence of dispossession so that they can claim the land back. But there's everything wrong with imagining that people have got this kind of evidence, particularly in a country like South Africa, or countries with issues, or rather countries with histories of colonialism, in that what do you refer to when a document was never issued, when there was dispossession? There was never some kind of, drawing to say, or demarcation of how much land you own. And so then, how do you then expect a community to then come in the post-apartheid era and demonstrate evidence of dispossession, right? When, for example, we can't rely on archives, right? Yeah. Because again, they are very much distorted. And so for me, it's always been interesting where you hear how in each community you visit, ancestral graves then are sort of placed as a kind of evidence, particularly in the absence of historical evidence of dispossession. But as I was engaging with Mama, another point that struck me is how people were not always relocated as a community. And if they were relocated as a community, they were not always placed in certain areas as a community. And so then, in this era of restitution, to then say to families that they have to constitute a community in order to be able to claim the land is quite problematic. And how constituting restitution in that way, as she was saying, to say, for example, they have to claim as a group, but what gets restituted is like a very, small piece of land that they have to share. Yeah. Whereas there's one farmer who actually owns, acres and acres of land, and how, both sort of compete for, what is at stake. I found that quite interesting. It was quite striking. So my last point is that, I find it also striking that there is a national problem, because what you see here, again, we've seen in Lephalale, questions around access to graves and questions around post-settlement, for example, are not just problems that are experienced by Mama's family only or the community. These are national related problems. And so there is something wrong here. Everything wrong with CPAs, conception of what a CPA is, what its role is, lack of direction from the government and so on. So I could start seeing some similarities, which was quite interesting. Yeah, I'll stop here, but I think that's what struck me, as we were engaging with Mama and Salem specifically.
I'm gonna go to Niren, but this is an open conversation, so anyone can speak at any point. But I think just to bring you into the conversation, obviously we've been going back to Salem over a long period of time, but I think it might be interesting just because we were in Lephalale a couple of weeks ago, and we see the same kind of echoes. It's game farms. It's like the way in which sites that should be protected sites with graves are being. You have recreational areas being built on them or next to them. I mean, I think this kind of sense of this being a national problem, I think is really interesting. And so I think maybe just like
Yeah.
to think about, I mean, because I think it was standing with Mr. Madinda outside Lindale, talking last year, that this kind of really hit. And I think it's partially also being kind of aware of Dineo's work and thinking slightly differently. But it's sort of interested in like, now sort of post the work that we're doing in the essay, like this kind of re-looking, and in the context of Lapalala, how you're kind of approaching the space in these.
Yeah. So you're taking me away from cricket then, Simon?
Yeah.
Fine.
Because I talk about
no,
cricket.
but for me, it was really interesting going to Lepalale because I think that was the second time I'd been there. We'd been there 2 years previously for a Marikana outreach thing. And what really struck me there, I think, is this strong sense that you get, which in Salem as well, that a rights-based society hasn't kind of like infiltrated into some parts of our country. And it's not just these small pockets, but it seems to be a much larger problem, right? And certainly something that kind of ties in with this, and maybe mine is a more emotional response, but the loudest echo that I felt between Lepalale and the Zeerveld, which is where Makhanda is, which is where Salem is, etc., are the words of Colonel Graham after the Fourth Frontier War, where he ordered his troops to clear the Zeerveld of every Amaklosa woman, man, child, cow, goat, anything, any existence. And this was extermination and erasure that exists, that the intent was extermination and erasure. And certainly now fast forwarding to Lepalale and fast forwarding to Salem again, especially with these game farms, there's this reinforcement of this idea of extermination and erasure of people, not just because if you don't have access to your ancestral graves, these graves slowly disintegrate and disappear. But also the type of kind of farming that happens, if you're farming crops or cows, there is a way that you can still somehow, even if you can't negotiate with the farmer and gain access to the land to see the graves, you could maybe make a plan, right? But when it comes to these big game farms, which are now becoming more and more pervasive in society, I mean, and there's this idea that what these game farms are doing are returning the land to itself. This idea that we are creating kind of nature again. We're bringing animals back again. Never mind that you're making a lot of dollars from having people, big game hunters coming in to shoot, etc. But what you're also doing is ensuring very clearly a securitization of that space by saying, look, we've got wild animals here. It's very difficult for you to kind of like even attempt to penetrate the space. So that extermination, that erasure of the land, which Graham talks about after the Fourth Frontier War, before Grahamstown is kind of built or whatever, still echoes right until today. And I think it also kind of then we need to think about this, returning to this notion of also the farmer and the notion of white genocide, because the narrative is always that, well, farmers put food on our table. But in a lot of instances what's happening is that these farmers are now converting the land from agricultural use to something which is very high-end, usually driven by foreign dollars, and usually has a leisure aspect to it, as Mrs. Madinda was talking about, a leisure aspect which re-traumatizes those graves and that land, creates new violences because people are doing water sports and having weddings and at Lindale on the graves of dead people, and it almost feels like, to quote Leseko Rampolokeng, it feels like Braai Day at Vlakplaas all over again, because you're having a braai on dead people's graves. So that's that's the more emotional input I'm kind of making now. But that was one of the strongest echoes that I certainly felt, connecting these two spaces. And I was, maybe a question, but we shouldn't hog the space, guys, and it is very much like a horizontal, kind of like just, come in where you feel you want to, or where the ancestors guide you to. But something else that I kind of thought was quite interesting is that in Lepalale, we spoke to grown men in their 50s and their 60s. Some of them wept, and culturally, men don't cry. And they were crying to people who were ostensibly strangers because they couldn't access their graves and because they felt that spiritual effect in their lives. I'm just wondering, Mrs. Madinda, your father, how did he deal with not going back to his family's graves since 1970 until now? What effect did he think it had on him? What weight did it place on him?
Can I jump in?
Sure.
Good afternoon, everyone, again. Firstly, I feel extremely underprepared for today. And that is because I did not know about a lot of the existing conversation around Salem that is actually happening. The way I'm actually here is I work with the National Arts Festival, and so we were afforded the opportunity to pick a number of shows to go to. And so this was a couple of days ago, and as I'm browsing the program, I come across this, and immediately the word that said Salem had my heart, it had my mind, and I'm like, I want to read about this. What is this? When the process started, I said to my father, I want to document this process. I want to be the one who captures the entire thing as a filmmaker. And I said, as a descendant of Salem, the forefathers of Salem, I want to be the one who tells this story because I want it to be told through the eyes, through the voices of people of the community without any outside influence. Unfortunately, I didn't have the opportunity to do that as of yet because I've been working in different areas and not spending as much time as I should at home. My name is Ndisiwe. I am the daughter of the gentleman that Umama keeps on referring to. My father is an advocate and was part of the community and the committee from the onset of this case. Fortunately, he's still alive. He's still in archive. That's walking around. He couldn't be here today. There was a funeral that he had to attend to back home. My grandfather, my great-grandfather, who both of them had isitembu, multiple wives, 7 in total, and my dad has 3, so that's 10. Yeah, all of them were based in Salem. I had the opportunity to actually grow up a bit there, but I think up until the age of 8. And just last week, my dad and I were having the conversation about, I actually want to go and build a little hut or home in Salem so that I can start my research with documentary. My fear is that I won't entirely be accepted into the community, as Umama had referred, to people who have not necessarily grown up amongst the community that now want to come back and feel like they have a claim over the land. But as a leader, my dad wanted to advise the community. But if you do not know him, you can misunderstand him very easily and very quickly. He's the most transparent person you'll ever meet. He lives by the book of the law. And when he is passionate about something, he becomes dedicated to that. Even when he was an educator, it got him into a lot of hot water because he always instilled discipline in people. And so the community members weren't entirely happy with the fact that he was not as emotional about the issue as they were. He was logical. And things like reading over legal documents that I've been reading through because they're obviously in his study at home and his office space, are part of the reason why I wanted and pushed for the idea of actually having a documentary over Salem. But being here today has just opened my eyes in ways that I could never have imagined. So thank you guys for the session. Initially, my thought was, why? It was misdirected. It really wasn't, why am I telling this story? But rather, what story would people like to hear? Which I do not think is the proper way of telling a story. And so my focus was always on what is Salem known about? Do they have a healthy land that has beautiful livestock, great game reserves, and all of that? And I did not look at the community as much as I should have. And so this for me today is a very huge lesson. I think my dad would be very sad that he wasn't here today. And as much as, what do they call them? I don't know. The vagabonds, yes, that's what I wanted, who want to take over the process of the community kind of working the land and all of that. Are trying to push members away like, Tatu Matinda, Tatu Nonzube and the rest. He will not die until he sees restoration in his community because he grew up there. My dad is 73 this year and he spent all of his life there. Even when he was an educator, he chose to stay inbound closer to Salem. So he's still very passionate about this issue. And I hope that we can have many, many more conversations around this because I think there's a lot to share. Yeah, I'm actually so overwhelmed. Yeah, I am. So, yeah, that's my 5 cents worth. I wish I could stay longer, but I am at work. I kind of just stole 1 hour to be on lunch. But yes, I think I'll put a pause there. Yes.
Thank you, Governor.
Thank you very much. I'm still going to stay.
Oh, okay.
Don't chase me out.
Sorry.
Don't chase me out.
Yeah.
So listening to Mama Dinda, the National Water Act, one of the things that sort of have placed it on a pedestal internationally was that it put justice at the center. And that obviously was connected to issues of rectifying the water injustices of the past in terms of access to water resources for previously disadvantaged communities. So I mean, it's very disappointing then in the context of that, having to listen to Mama Dinda talking about not having the community not having access to water because someone is dammed off water, because an easy fix is that implement the National Water Act as it's supposed to function, and then maybe not solving the restitution issues, but at least there's a relief in terms of water access, because the water use licenses that the farmers have definitely regulate their water use. The licensing conditions will talk about how they can use water. And part of that connects to restrictions on the impeding of the flow of water. And obviously that's because, water is variable over space and time, and what you do on one side might affect water downstream or whatever in terms of quality and quantity. And that is a way, regulating that is a way of keeping balance between different water users. So if you've got the Department of Water and Sanitation not doing something about a problem that I'm sure report and a problem that's been reported and there's no action on it for what would seem like years, it really speaks to now another problem. The problems that are there in terms of the implementation of the National Water Act, and actually the way that it's the justice element that is there has been subverted because of the inability of government to enforce that act. Yeah.
Uyabona ke Xoloseng, isikindenzela into ndifuna ukukhala. Ukwabuza uNiren into yoba from 1970 sisimka utata engakwazi ukudibana nezinyanya zakhe nootamkhulu bakhe phaa, nathi singakwazi ukuya, kwenzeka ntoni? Asazi noba mhlawumbi utata ndisaphilana ngoku, ukuba mhlawumbi ebekwazile ukuya emathuneni phaa emangcwabeni kutamkhulu bakhe. Akafilishi nandi, khangafilishe kakuhle, ekhalela ukuya phaa. Amangcwaba aphesha komlambo, asikwazi ukuya ngenxani yomfana ongayikhatheleleyo le nto. Thina impilo yethu, ubomi bethu, asazi mhlawumbi nathi uba singabantwana nabazukulwana sawukwazi njani ukuya, ngoba siyafuna ukuya emangcwabeni ootamkhulu, silungise amangcwaba ootamkhulu. Sizawuphinda ke ngoku, ndithethe noobraza bam, ndathi makhe siphinde sithethe nalo mlungu, siye. Ukuba akavumi kwakhona, ingathi ndawucela into yokuba ndisincedise nani, ningenelele. Cha ndazi njani na, kodwa ke ningenelele into yokuba sikwazi ukuya kulaa mangcwaba. Utata uyongcwatyelwa kwindawo engafunekanga ingcwatyelwe kuyo, simngcwabele phaa eCastle Farm. Umama nanga amangcwaba wakhe apha eRhini, ingcwaba lakhe apha eRhini. Before utata asweleke, ushiye umthetho othi kuthi, wathi nincede nothatha umama nizombeka ecangkwani. Uyabona uba yenye iprocess yomnye umngcwabo leyo. And thina ngoku le nto sesiyibona le nto, ngoku beyithetha besiyithetha ingathi uyadlala, iyihleka. Siyibona ngoku kwiwili yakhe ithi ze siyothatha umama. Ngelishwa le wili ke ngoku thina yakhe siyifunda sele singcwabile. Ngesasiyenze loo nto yonke laa nto ngelaa xesha. Yenye iprocess esingazi uba kule nto yengokuba asinamali, ngoba kaloku umhlaba asikwazi uveza imali apha emhlabeni, ngoba ngoku siphila ngale mali, siphila ngemali zegranti. Sizayenza njani le nto ke ngoku xa naba belungu bengafuni basiye, ngoba mhlawumbi kaloku iindlela zisawuvuleka xa siye emangcwabeni, sibe nendlela. Ngoba xa uye kwizinyanya zakho uyakwazi into yokuba indlela ibe khona, zikubonisa indlela.
Uyayitolika sisi?
Ndawukhala nam.
Yeah, no, my saying that, yeah, it's a massive problem for the family. They are planning again to go again with her brother to the farmer and to try and get across the river, talk to the farmer, see if they can get agreement, get across the river to go and see the graves. The problem is that it's created a significant, because the family is disconnected from, is spiritually disconnected. And now it's put them in a position where even contemporary burials of family members are sort of scattered, you know. She says her mother is buried here in Grahamstown. Her father is buried in the farm, Castle Farm, but he left instructions, even in his will, that they have to fetch the remains of their mother from Grahamstown and make sure that she's reburied with their father. And clearly, you know, it's unsaid, but clearly then there's another element of, a quiet instruction of they should be buried with the rest of the family, because she did say that he was buried where he was not supposed to be buried. So clearly, where he's supposed to be buried is with the rest of the family. So yes, she does request should this attempt fail, for people such as ourselves in our different capacities, think about and see what we can do for them as a community in this situation. Yeah.
I think we were talking about it in the car, but it's ridiculous that there is no legislation around this. That there's no, we were standing next to Lindale Farm on the road, so we can see, and so Dineo can point out, at least we can't see them directly, but where the graves are. And even standing there, there's like this feeling of, because of the way that Salem is, because of the kind of paranoia there from the white farmers, like, you feel like you're not even supposed to be in that space, and you're looking across this land that hasn't been returned, that should have been returned, and feeling like you're worried that to even stand there and talk about that on some level. And I think like Mrs. Medina she experiences this kind of discrimination, the kind of racism in that space more regularly, and is able to stand up to it. But for me, it's still shocking. Like, and the feeling that you're being watched, the feeling that like you're worried about something coming to tell us to fuck off, to go somewhere else, because we just want to know what's happening. I think it's like, it's such a strange space, but it's completely fucking ridiculous to stand there and we can't go there. We can't, like that if you're a tourist who can go and access that, you can go hunting there or whatever, but the community that's right there can't do that, and there's no kind of provision within the law to make that possible.
Yeah, absolutely. That I was struck by how, with a country like South Africa, with a deep history of dispossession, forced removals, that you don't have legal writing around the alienation of ancestral graves as heritage in, for example, land transactions. So that means that often farmers either lease or buy the land with those ancestral graves, and as a result, then they can put that restriction to say you are not allowed here, and that's why they can actually take out a gun and say this is private property. But there is a question here, which is, how is it private property when it has got this portion of heritage? Because graves, for example, are protected by the Heritage Act in South Africa. So what it means is that we do need a law that actually legislates that, to state that in a case or an event of a transaction, that portion has to be alienated and it remains sort of public property. But two, I think it also signals a problem in how the state conceives or understands land and the restitution, which Simon and I have always had these discussions around how we think about the land only in material terms, and you see in how it has played itself out, for example, in claims, particularly in land restitution, where communities aren't given back the land where they used to live. So, you claim land A, but you get given land B. But we don't think about what are the implications of that, because the exact land that you would have claimed, that's the land you would have worked, lived, and therefore started burying there over time, where you've got connections. So to get another piece of land elsewhere, which is not so meaningful, is really not useful. Because, as Umama is saying, that when African people are sick, when you're applying for a job, when you're getting married, when you've had a child, you go and speak to your father and state your case. So I'm about to apply for a job. I ask for your guidance and so on. And that has come across, all the narrative accounts that we've collected where, even if people are actually Christian, they still have that sense of relationship that they have with their ancestors. So you can imagine the psychological, emotional, and spiritual disturbance that it actually does to not have that access. And in her case, I absolutely understand the frustration, like to not have been able to go to your father's and grandfather's grave since the 1970s. It's problematic. And it creates some kind of generational, I'd say even trauma, because, there's young ones who need to have some kind of a relationship with, where her father is, and so on. My last point is that there was never this connection or understanding of the relationship between land, life, and death. And so calls about, the land and saying return the land back are calls about dignity, but also because the land is quite central in how it shapes, for example, what we return to, because we don't cremate, for example. So if you don't have a piece of land, then the question is, where am I being returned to? And that's why the land is actually important. Because now, for example, her father has had to be buried in a place he didn't want to be buried, right? And imagine what that creates for her to say, then where will I be buried, right? And my argument is that with a generation that is 60, 70, 80 years old in this period in South Africa, those shouldn't be the questions that people are worrying about, which is, where's home? Where am I going to be returned to?
I think, what makes this case in Salem so interesting or important to think with is some of the stuff we're looking at around access to graves in Lephalale, those are not cases where the land has been restituted. So we're talking about a case where land has been restituted, but this was excluded, which is both important to say, what is wrong with the idea of restitution, that we cannot conceive of what is also being dispossessed here. We are restituting and at the same time we're dispossessing, because now they can't make another claim. So that unless something really changes in the law, that access is not necessarily going to be granted. You can't go back and try and claim that land. And so the failure of our imagination around what restitution means, of failure to understand history and what is being dispossessed, is really shows here. And it's a problem that goes beyond Salem, but I think the particularity of Salem being a case where we have had a process of restitution and it has failed on this is really important.
You know what you were referring to about, as African people, we go to the graves and all of that. My father has 17 siblings, and of that 17, 15 went missing. They would leave and never come home again. And my mom always says, and makes reference to, it is because anikwazi ukuya emangcwabeni, and you guys have no access to your ancestors' graves. And so you will always have this dark cloud over the family, because there's that one thing that you haven't done, and that was to find the bones. And I think the missing siblings represents the missing heritage and history that we lost in Salem, And as a traditional healer, as a sangoma, I also feel it's part of my duty to restore dignity to my family in We may not find their bones and return them home, but I think the least that they should know wherever they are is that they actually do have a home. And that's what restitution is really, for me, all about, you know. Yeah, but one day we'll find answers, hopefully. One day. Yeah.
This end of the time.
Yeah, I was going to ask what people think restitution should look like. You know, we've spoken a lot about how it's failed, but I would be interested to hear what people think.
Yeah, I mean, sorry.
No, go ahead.
So I mean, I think there's a lot of different questions, I think, in terms of thinking about what restitution could be. And I think we need a better understanding of dispossession. So I mean, one of the questions that, you know, was supposed to be part of this talk, but we maybe don't get to, but it's like something like work is also dispossessed with the land. And you can think of different ways in which we can think about restituting work through things like basic income grants and stuff like that, which is not about job creation, which is actually thinking about other ways of thinking about being on the land, about supporting other ways of existing that don't necessarily mean wage labor. But I think what's super interesting about the access to the graves is that it's not about property. And this is the major problem, the way that land has been conceived as a commodity, as property. And the reduction of land to property, I think, is very limiting in terms of what we can imagine in terms of restitution. So the idea of access, the idea of land that is not necessarily has to be owned or conceived of as property, as commodity, opens up questions around, like, what does it mean to have land in common? Or what would it mean to have land that is accessible, that is open, that is public? Well, not public, because I think the kind of public-private thing is very much something that is within an idea of property. But are there other ways to conceive of land and the restitution process that is not about giving back ownership? Because I think that's always going to be constrained by ideas of property. It's always going to be within this kind of capitalist commodity of land. And so I think that, I mean, in Lapalala, what's interesting is that people were saying that what they want is just access. They're not trying to, like, take that land. They just want access. And I think we can, like, push that a lot further, like push that idea of access, push that idea of other ways of sharing land that are not about just returning property. And I'm not sure exactly where that goes or how we land it, but I think that some of these questions open up different ways of thinking that allow us, because we need to get out of this idea of land as property, otherwise I think we're always going to fail. I mean, I think they're both questions around restitution in terms of, like, what more can be done to support the farmers, to support people like Mr. Madinda trying to work within a certain system. And then there are also questions around, like, how do we think beyond the system that we have? And I think there's failures in both senses. There's failures in, like, the practical ways in which government could actually be doing a lot more to support farmers within the current system. And then there's ways we can actually break down that system. And I think both are kind of important, because it's important that we go beyond this current system that's failing, but also there's practical lived experiences that are happening every day that also we need to improve the support that we're doing in the short term. And I think, yeah, I mean, Ms. Medina can speak to her struggles a lot with government, with funding, with subsidies, with access to markets, the way that, like, there's still pervasive racism, there's still, like, things that close off access to markets that really make, I think, starting a farm difficult. And I mean, and they're just things of, like, breaking into agriculture, into those markets is incredibly difficult in this country, because most successful countries, or most countries with a kind of successful agricultural industry, subsidize their farmers a lot. Standardly, that is part of the way that agriculture works, and we don't have that. So we have kind of massive industrial scale farms, which is also, I mean, yeah. Anyway, like, maybe I'll stop there.
So I think for me, my argument is that you can't repair until you understand what was broken. So I think for me, the starting point is for us to really start rethinking what was actually lost with dispossession. Because the assumption is that people simply lost the material land and therefore just give them back another portion and they should be fine. When actually, for example, if you look, and this is one of the most interesting work that actually tries to make sense of dispossession, which is the work of Plaiki. And I know it's cited a lot, but there's a section which really resonated with me when I was doing my own work, where he cites the Kobadi family in 1913, which at the time, just after the passing of the Land Act, they are basically moving from that private farm, and a daughter of the Kobadi family falls ill in the middle of the night, and it does look like literally she's not going to make it. And so she dies on that evening as they're traveling, moving to another farm. And so Plaiki then describes how in that moment they dig a grave under a tree, and they're worried about who is going to see them, but they also obviously don't have a place to bury, their daughter, and so they bury her under this tree in the evening and just, trying to make sure that nobody actually notices, right? So it's the idea of stealing a grave. So who steals a grave? I mean, that would be a person who doesn't have a sense of home, doesn't have, that dignity, and he frames it around a notion of citizenship. And I think makes a lovely connection to the materiality of the land, but also questions or a relationship with the incorporeal aspects of it. So what you don't see, which is lost. And I don't think that the state understood that there's certain intangible things that were lost when the land was dispossessed. And that is the connection. And so until you understand that, you will have a very flawed sense of restitution. I think that is the problem. And that's why you'll also have, dangerous discourse around just give them jobs. They don't need the land, right? And we've seen, for example, how the DA was quite comfortable with that model to say, look, if you give people enough jobs, then maybe they won't need the land. But that just shows you, and it's not just the DA, even, an ANC-led government at some point also didn't quite understand or grasp what dispossession actually has meant. So for me, I'd say until we actually really go back to that, then we will never actually get it right. And that's why we haven't gotten it right. And she's still, talking about questions of, pariahness, as in, you're still looking for a place to bury, and you're burying in a place and not honoring, your father's wishes about where they would have loved to be laid to rest. So for me, I think it's just going back to the drawing board and just thinking about that. And then we can imagine new ways of shaping restitution or restoration, and one that it is more dignified, because there's no dignity in getting back the land, but you can't work it. And you're told you're lazy, right? And that's why when you give the land to Black people, it fails, because they're just lazy. When actually there's a problem here around post-settlement support.
Just to add one point to what you're saying, what would land restitution look like? I think the starting point is a simple one, and it's a question that all of us at SWOP have been engaged with for several years, which is, what is not returned when land is? I think that should be the question from which we start to then reimagine what we kind of thinking of, because it does a lot of the shackles, like, for example, like the Constitutional Court judgment. I mean, this idea that these primary Victorian colonial intrusions are aloof of the settlement, cricket and the church, whereas the graves are not even considered, even though Cameron in his judgment goes like, we're mindful of history, but there's no real care or concern for the Black history that is there. It's there. So we need to prompt.
I mean, just to sort of going back a little bit, like one of the things that I think was also dispossessed in a sense is the ability to articulate an idea of life where work and land are intertwined, where work is not wage labor. And I think that, like, even those ability to think in a way needs to address what has been taken in order to imagine something else. Because I think when we start to look at how much was dispossessed, it's not just like, I mean, not, it's like ideas and ways of imagining life that are also being taken. And that's a kind of imagination of work and land that I think we've lost. And in a country where there's like such massive unemployment, and also the obviously the massive problem of land dispossession, like being able to think about that differently, I think is really important. And we need to be able to accept things like there will never probably be enough jobs in this country. So we need to imagine work beyond wage labor. We need to imagine other ways of thinking of work that is not constrained by those kinds of colonial concepts of how we understand work, how we understand land, how those should connect. And I think that is, I mean, part of the work of thinking through dispossession and thinking about what is lost is opening up the possibility to think differently about a different kind of yet to come than what we've been told is the only way to imagine, is that we need more jobs. We need to, this is how land distribution must work. This, you know, like there's a very like narrow sense of what we've been told we can think within.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, continuing in my mind with from where you guys are talking, Niren and Simon, so sort of like deproletarianization, you know, where you sort of reconnecting, you know, people back to the land, reimagining the relationship between people and land beyond capitalist notions. Yeah, it's a reimagination of the relationship between people and nature as well, more broadly. And maybe a much more significant dispossession is the water dispossession, you know, because it's not even on the radar in discussions, popular discussions. Well, not that it's not on the radar in academic discussions, it is, but very much overshadowed by, you know, other forms of dispossession, land in particular. But of course, if we go back, we're talking about restitution, you know, 1913, there's always 1912 Irrigation and Water Conservation Act. So those things, those are in tandem. In fact, the water one came first in preparation for the arguably for the Land Act in 1913. So there, you know, when you think about what's written in the House of Palo, where they in that book, where they talk about water being, and it made sense that at that time land was much more available, but water resources were limited. And it talked about water in a way where actually that was the signifier of identity, you know. Obviously, I don't want to go too far with that because obviously I wasn't alive back then and such. And yeah, I'm not too sure about how far you can stretch that, but the way that author puts it, he says, people fought for, and the young warriors had a responsibility to make sure nobody drinks from a river except for the people of the community. And that was sort of connected to not only that, okay, well, limited water, maybe much more land, but also people moved around a lot more, you know. But what would always be problematic would be water. And obviously, you can go back and even think about the founding of tribes like Bakwena. You know, Bakwena, the ones in Lesotho, the ones in Botswana, etc., were founded from drought, you know, significant drought. So significant that what was a singular tribe had to break apart as, you know, they went north to Botswana, to Lesotho, looking south to Lesotho, looking for water. In any case, let me bring that back. So, can we then, because right now water is something that is secondary, you know, it's an input. If we're going back to capitalist notions of relations with nature, it's an input for industry, farming, etc. Can we reimagine it in a way where we're going a little bit back to, you know, discourses of water that are non-capitalist, that are non-productive? Are those completely lost? I remember talking to a relative, and he was from the Free State, and he was telling me about Free State, Drakensberg side. And he's telling me about there's a river monster, what, we're not allowed to go to that particular side of the river. And I was so angry when I responded to him. I was like, you're talking rubbish. There's no such a thing, you know. You know, the water's there, you can go if you want, whatever. And it only later did I realize that, no. Those are the discourses that were lost around water. What I'm coming with is water as something productive, something that you can put to use. It's water, H2O. And this man is still thinking, so it's still there in some communities. It's still there. But can we reimagine it? Can we refashion it? Can we reuse it so that it fits into things like Simon is talking about, where you sort of deproletarianizing rural South African life and bringing people closer to nature, where they can sustain their lives without necessarily being overly dependent on wages. I don't know.
I just wanted to pick up again on your point about the perversion of enclosures and dispossession in the name of conservation, for example. So, yeah, like at Restitution, which is a protected area of the Eastern Cape, and people were forcibly removed there in the 70s. And there are people now who live outside the fences and the gates and can see the places where they know the graves of their family are. And I think after a lot of negotiation, some managed to negotiate for access, but the quality of the access was not cared for. So because of this thing of wild animals, rewilding, I mean, Dwesakwebe has got wildebeest. It doesn't have big five. It's got buck, and it's, you know. But the people who wanted to visit their grave were forced to go with an armed ranger who was with them at all times, somebody with a gun. They were not allowed to build fire, which they wanted to spend the night there and carry out what they needed to carry out to be in relationship with that space and their ancestors. So, you know, this thing about the need for legislation, for access, like the quality of that access needs to be carefully specified to align with the customary needs of what that access is. It's not meaningful if it's just about you can go there, but to be accompanied by a uniformed man with a gun completely undermine that experience, re-traumatize people, and they haven't done that again. And we see that a huge amount in the Eastern Cape, this like perverse thing around rewilding, returning the land, a kind of moral argument for conservation that in fact is an ongoing colonialism. It pushes people off. The land is even less accessible than before because of the fences and it's not just private land, it's private land with dangerous animals, armed men, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's something we have to address.
I mean, there's something about like the farmers might be terrible, but they're dependent on labor, and there's the fact that you have to deal with people
You have to have
living.
relationships.
Yeah. Once you start the logic of a game farm, your needs for labor go way down, and then you don't have to deal with people. So that's, I mean, what we're seeing in Levelade, like people being shifted off that land because you're no longer dependent on labor tenants. And I mean, not to say that those labor tenants were well treated. I mean, there's like serious violence there as well. But there is this kind of way to remove people from the land, or from the way that the land was imagined. And yeah, as you said, like you use this kind of moral arguments about ecology around like restoring something, about protecting something as a form of exclusion, as a form of dispossession.
And it erases the fact that there's never been a land without people.
Yeah.
And it erases that and says conservation and protection requires that people go somewhere else. And
Yeah.
that's a lie.
Is that a point to wrap up the discussion, or does anyone want to?
Beginning of something else. I'm going to talk about the Zimbabwe test match next.
I would just like to ask, are there any people or organizations that are working to get ancestral graves into legislation in some way that you may know of through your research, or and if there are any examples of where it has worked and been done in a dignified way in our country or elsewhere. Just thoughts about that.
In South Africa, no.
No.
There aren't. I mean, institutions that work around land questions that are renowned its class in University of UWC, LAC, which is UCT. However, they don't look at this question. But I mean, I think, and we're talking about strategy, and I think it was Tasneem who brought it up as well, right? If I'm correct, which is to say, how then do you make this weighty? So once we've done the research, how would it gain momentum? And I think one way then is to then bring these institutions to the fore. Look, the issues there was always a lack of understanding around issues about graves, or maybe not even any care. But at the moment, because of extractivism, so coal extraction, platinum in different provinces, that heightened issues around, for example, exhumation, desecration, also questions around access. And so then we thought, within SWOP that this is something definitely that we need to take up. And I think there's strength in being able to show that it's a national problem. And I've always shared with Simon. Simon and I have worked on the land restitution bill in 2012-13. And it was interesting how questions around access emerged, even though it was obviously just about, the failures of restitution. So a market-driven land reform program in South Africa and so on. But it came out quite strongly, and so that's why we thought that then maybe it's something that we need to take up, because this is not just Mam Madinde's story. We've picked it up in Lephalale, we've picked it up in the Mpumalanga province. Also on both private agricultural farmland, where we would have labor tenant families, but also on customary land, which is under traditional authority. So then it is really a national problem that I think we need to take up. And there is SARA that we could work with. It's a state organ which protects ancestral graves. So there is some ways of bringing SARA together, for example, with the Department of Land Reform, in conversation about the subject. So we're ambitious, but we'll see.
Dineo is the expert. This is the person, and her book is amazing. It's a very beautiful book, and we have some here if you guys are interested.